Thank you, Elder Valerie. What a wonderful way to start our journey today. Over the next few days, to open our first summit day, we have a special guest who is visiting Canada from South Africa. Dr. Saul Cobbing is a qualified physiotherapist and biokineticist and is an associate professor in the discipline of physiotherapy at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Durban, South Africa. He is currently spending a sabbatical year in Canada as a visiting professor in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Toronto. He is married and has two children, Daniel, 11, and Lola, 8. Welcome, Dr. Cobbings.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful welcome from Elder Nicholson. That was really inspiring. I'm going to try and share my screens here. I hope everyone can hear me and see me clearly.
Yes.
Good morning, bonjour, sanibonani, as we say from my home in South Africa. My name is Saul Cobbing. I'm a professor of physiotherapy at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and I'm fortunate to be a visiting professor on sabbatical here in the Department of Physical Therapy at the University of Ontario, where I am sitting right now. The greeting Sanibona from the isiZulu people means literally, I see you all and see your humanity. I would also like to just briefly express my gratitude for being given the opportunity to work on the traditional land of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, and also acknowledge the indigenous people of Southern Africa who are co-creators in my research, which will form part of the discussion today. I'm briefly going to talk about episodic disability, a brief definition for those people who weren't here yesterday at the amazing talks that were given yesterday. And I'm then going to look at it from the point of view of employees, which is the focus of today's session. And then I want to briefly look at the similarities that I've picked up between South Africa and Canada, and then finally just finish with some strategies for a way forward to help people living with episodic disability, because ultimately that's why we're all here today. So what is episodic disability? For those who aren't aware, it's a concept where a lot of work's been done in HIV research, where I should have mentioned that most of my work has been done. And it's this idea of health challenges, multifactorial health challenges that fluctuate daily or over longer periods of time. So it's not just a fixed condition that isn't changing. It's ever changing, up and down, often invisible, and has many, many health consequences for the people who are affected by episodic disability. It's something where a lot of work has been done in Canada. And when I became aware of it was through the work of people like Prof. Kelly O'Brien, who spoke yesterday. And it's informed a lot of my research and my colleagues' research. Just as an example of some of the work being done in South Africa, we did 2 large cohort studies of people living with HIV. So over 1,000 in each of the cohorts, one in my province of KwaZulu-Natal, which is the epicenter of the HIV pandemic in the world, and the other in the province of Gauteng, which is the economic hub of South Africa, where Johannesburg is. And look at those numbers. We had 35.5% of people in KwaZulu-Natal and almost 52% of people in Gauteng reporting that they were experiencing disability as defined by the World Health Organization's disability assessment schedule, which very much is related to episodic disability and the ICF classification of disability. So those are quite complex studies showing all sorts of health challenges over 6 domains. But what kept coming through with a lot of the participants and in both studies was absolutely significant was the strong association between mental health, which is also a focus of the summit and was discussed in length yesterday, and functional limitations. And just note that I'm saying in association, there's nothing causative. We're not saying one causes the other, but effectively a lot of people living with episodic disability also report a lot of cognitive and mental health problems that become an added burden to their experiencing of life and work. If I can have the next slide, please. So I've done quite a lot of reading, as I say, both from South Africa, but now particularly being in Toronto, and the work being done around episodic disability and how it affects employees. And these references come out of work done in Canada, and I'll put them at the end for anyone who's interested. But what people find is that episodic disability is a major barrier to negotiating employment relationships. So because it's hard to fit these kinds of conditions, think of something like long COVID, think of living with the functional limitations related to HIV or fibromyalgia, for example, or ME. It's very hard to kind of fit it into a category, and it's very difficult for employees to negotiate working conditions with their employers. There's a concept called intermittent work capacity, IWC, which, to be honest, not a lot of people are aware of, but I understand there are a lot of employers or people from the business world at the summit, and there are some people who absolutely understand it and provide adaptations and flexible working relationships for their employees. But a lot of employers, and unfortunately, view this as a very difficult thing. It provides instability, it affects the company's profits, and as such, employers are discriminated against, employees. And this happens a lot in South Africa, where the concept of things like episodic and disability and IWC is not known at all, and people have to essentially hide the issues they're having in order to retain their jobs. What also ends up happening, and work comes out of Canada, but I've also seen it in South Africa, is many individuals living with ED choose to remain on social assistance. So if they're receiving some kind of social grant or benefit, employment benefit, they rather remain on that rather than looking for work options because of all of the complications around this area. And they don't want to threaten their income security in any way in the event of a relapse, in the event of being in one of those very tough stages of their condition. And this, just a little story out of South Africa, when I first started working in the area of HIV, there were a lot of people living with HIV who chose to not actually seek treatment, because at that point, the government was saying your CD4 count, your level of immunity, had to be below a certain level to get the unemployment benefit. So people, because jobs are so hard to come by and there's such complications with keeping your employment when you're living with episodic disability, they chose to rather not go on treatment to receive the grants and be able to support their family. And these are some of the sort of bigger complications around these kinds of things. The next slide, please. So what similarities have I picked up between Canada and South Africa? There are lots I'm seeing, but these are just a couple. There's a real intersectionality of the impact of episodic disability and access to health services. So it's not just that, okay, someone is living with long COVID or HIV. Their gender comes over. We've heard over and over again how women are overly burdened by these episodic disabilities. People of color, there's a lot of evidence now of long COVID disproportionately affecting Black people and people who are marginalized economically, which is often people of color. There's a lot of gaslighting of people living with episodic disability. Gaslighting is one of these kind of new buzzwords, but effectively people are made to feel like they're crazy, because they go in and there's not a smoking gun, let's say. There's not a blood test or an actual diagnosis. They're coming in saying things like, I feel really fatigued. I've got this kind of brain fog. I struggle to, on different days I feel great, on other days I don't. And people go, well, are you sure this is not all in your head? Look, you should just get back to work. Policy not always being backed up by practice. And this is something I thought, South Africa, we're big on policy, but Canada has amazing policies. And both Canada and South African policies are are firmly embedded in sort of the human rights narrative and health equity narratives, but we don't always see practice, unfortunately, following the wonderful policies. And I must say, I thought coming to Canada, I'm coming now to visit the hallowed land where everything works perfectly and people are given every service, and this is something I can learn and take home. But I'm realizing these similarities are actually more than the difference, Any changes that have actually been brought about are generally due to patient advocacy, not the government or employers. Okay, so it's people who are burdened themselves by these conditions, who are having to do extra work to get notice, to get resources, to make sure policy is implemented correctly. And I think of people like the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, without whom we wouldn't have universal access to ARVs in South Africa. People like Realize, who are hosting events like this in Canada and representing people who need help. So a lot of similarities. There are very stark differences, which is a conversation for another day. There's huge health inequity between the global north, the more privileged westernized world, and particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where I come from. But that's, as I say, a conversation for another day. And what I'm realizing in Canada, as much as everything looks great on the surface, you go into certain communities and speak to certain people, and they are struggling. So if we just can go to the last slide, please. So, I'm sure the summit is about strategies of moving forward. How can we make things even a little bit better for people living with episodic disability? The one thing from the point of view of people who themselves live with episodic disability, and we know many of you are wearing both hats. You're a health professional, you're a policymaker, but you are yourself living with one of these conditions. You've got to become proficient at navigating the system, know your policies, and initiate these sorts of discussions. The representative who spoke to us yesterday from Labour told us that it has to be the employer who often is initiating discussions around things like accommodation and accessibility. But employers have to do better in terms of accommodation, flexibility. Okay, if we want to take anything good out of the COVID pandemic, surely we can see that we can be more flexible in our work arrangements. And inclusivity, realizing the intersectionality of these conditions and making sure everyone is included and not left behind. We need improved access to health services, still, always. And people working in the health services need to understand these things. Okay, so a brief example in South Africa, when they had universal access to antiretroviral treatments. Up to 80% of people living with HIV were able to go back to work. Okay, so health services do matter. There has to be more flexibility in the disability benefit system. It can't just be you are either disabled or you are 100% fine. We need something in between for those gray areas. And this is where a lot of episodic disability falls. And finally, the point, just more support from all of us. I'm a physiotherapist. I'm a health professional. I'm also set in my ways. The long COVID thing has brought about a big discussion around exercise. Jessica touched on it briefly yesterday. Exercise, which we use as one of our major tools in physiotherapy, turns out to be often very counterproductive and cause setbacks for people living with long COVID and other episodic disability. So we have to question our own practice and believe people living with episodic disability, work with them, be led by them to make their life better. Thank you very much. My next slide just says, Ngiyabonga kakhulu ngabe unemibuzo, which means thank you very much in isiZulu. Do you have any questions? There are also some references to slides, which I'm happy to share with people. They're all open access, these articles.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cobbing. It's excellent to hear from you. I am going to just put it out there to the participants. Are there any questions at this point for Dr. Cobbing?
No, but thank you very much.
I'll be sticking around later if people think of something and they want to ask me later or drop me a message on the chat. happy to take questions.